The street was syrup-slow with late-afternoon sunlight, the kind that made every dust mote feel sacred and every front lawn glow like an invitation. Suburban houses stood in a row like sentinels, trim hedges, mailboxes, tidy driveways, until the silence broke with the staccato bark of radio static and the whisper of shoes on asphalt. Sergeant Daniel Hargrove and Officer Miles Carter moved like a single organism. Practiced, taught, the gestures of men who'd been trained to read danger in the tilt of a roofline, in the way a dog stared at a stranger. They had pulled up to a call that should have been routine, a reported disturbance. A neighbor worried about a uniformed woman pacing outside a house. It was the sort of call supervisors log with a shrug and a checklist. For Hargrove, it was another day in a decade of uniform. For Carter, still early in his career, it tasted like a rope he could hold on to and learn to knot. She was in uniform, tactical vest molded to a lithe frame, department badge glinting on her chest, a sidearm holstered to her hip. Her hair was pulled back into a practical knot. And her face, bronze composed, a jaw that had been taught to hold still in the face of chaos, had the expression of someone counting her breaths. The neighbors clustered like punctuation marks, a gasp here, a smartphone raised there, because human drama always needed witnesses. The officers called out instructions. Their voices were professional, clipped a practice recital. When the woman turned, the sunlight braided through her ponytail and caught the badge pinned to her vest. It took a beat, a quick electric pause, for the men to register what they thought they saw. A uniform, yes, but not the right kind of uniform in their eyes. A woman on a porch where a domestic call had escalated in someone's mind into a suspicion. Things that look like certainties in the instant perception can be made of fragile halves. Hargrove moved in with that lethal mixture of confidence and assumption that officers are taught. Assume control, assume compliance, assume the best of intentions only if the situation fits the textbook. He barked a command to step back, to show hands. Miles reached the cuff with the brisk, mechanical courtesy of someone checking boxes. She swung her phone to her ear with a deliberate motion, fingers steady, and said a single phrase, a name in a short sentence, that slid past the officers like a blade through mist. "I'm responding. This is officer." Her tone did not beg. It did not plead. It was iron wrapped in velvet. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Carter's brow pinched. The neighbor who called pointed, eyes wide, voice skittering. The officers saw a woman whose identity didn't match their immediate schema for authority. Their training collided with perception. And in that collision, a decision was born. They would detain her, cuff her with a firmness meant to teach. The cuffs clicked. The sound was small and final, a thread cutting a seam. The uniformed woman did not scream. Her breath was a low, even metronome. Her colleagues, there were no colleagues on that street, only the distant hum of a police cruiser and a courthouse of television opinions, were not here to witness the curl of metal on skin, the short walk to the squad car. Cameras flashed from porches. Phones recorded the choreography of an event that would be replayed and interpreted 1,000 ways. In the space between the click of handcuffs and the slam of a car door, she raised her free hand, thumb finding the screen of her phone like a lifeline. Her fingers moved with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed in other, harsher rooms. "I need to call my union," she said, voice low, and then pressed the contact that would change everything. The air seemed to tilt. A suburban afternoon was about to fracture into 1,000 smaller tragedies. Her thumb found a number that had lived in her contacts for years, a single, tight string of digits labeled with a name that meant protection, history, and a professional scaffold, supervisor. It said in the cramped sans serif of an overstuffed phone book. She tapped the call with neat, exhaled hope. The phone rang once, twice, a small metronome in the small of her palm. For Hargrove, for Carter, the call was noise, interference in a procedure. For the woman, it was oxygen. The screen glowed with a name as if the device itself believed the sound could summon the rightness of the world back into place. When the supervisor answered, the voice came like a bell, steady, incredulous. "This is Lieutenant Marlowe," he said. He was the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning to read the world from the inside out, whose face had been mapped by granite decisions and softer regrets. What followed was a tide. The lieutenant's voice on the line rose first in disbelief, and then in a syntax of command so automatic that even measured men found themselves swept. "Where are you? Who are the officers? Keep calm. Stay where you are." He asked for the badge numbers, names that threaded into the department's ledger, and the woman supplied them with the even clip of someone reciting a hymn learned in hardship. The call widened, like the first drop of oil in still water that spreads until the whole surface is altered. The lieutenant's hand became a compass. He would call the station. He would call internal affairs. He would call anyone who could explain the brute algebra of two uniforms colliding like planets. Miles felt the temperature of the moment shift. The confident posture that had been his armor now felt like an accusation. Across town, for families who would later watch the news, the sound of that single call would wedge into their chest like a shard. For the woman's sister, tacked into the emergency contact list, a phone that always vibrated at odd hours. The ring meant 100 possible endings. For Hargrove and Carter, the line in the lieutenant's voice was not merely procedural. It was a recalibration of power. When the supervisor said he was sending backup, his breath was a tether that pulled the officers from certainty into accountability. Something in the crowd recoiled. Gossip became the first rumor, and the neighbors watched as institutional gravity began to reassert itself. And then the line was passed, a thin, tinny breath of an order that would ripple. The lieutenant wanted the body-worn camera footage. He wanted the radio transcript. He wanted the story written on the page before the story could be written in gossip. The woman kept her grip on the phone even as she was led toward the car, eyes calm, shoulders and architecture patience. She had made that call because she believed, with the narrow and defiant faith of someone who had been softened by pain and then made harder by duty, that systems could correct themselves if given the chance. But calls do not undo the shapes they witness. They only record them. Her voice on the line was both shield and challenge, like a polished blade that calls attention to a wound. The first ring had shattered the easy narrative. This was not just a simple arrest. It was now a thing that would be witnessed, archived, and judged. The single call threaded itself through radios and phones and the public square, and in every place it landed it made people look up. Phones love a moment that appears tidy enough to be categorized. The neighbor's clip, 40 seconds of compressed heat, found its way into the internet with the speed of rumor turned into something more volatile. The woman's arrest, the metallic click of cuffs, the wary angles of the officers' faces. All of it became a rectangle of light fed into a hungry field of opinion. At first it rolled like a small stone, like shared, retweeted, then gathered speed. Each replay was a refracted truth, each comment a new refracted angle. Some watchers saw the crisp violation of a badgeless assumption. Others saw only procedure, read from a posture of deference to uniforms as gospel. The clip did not lie. It could not contain all the nuance of the day, only a single electric fraction. It was, nevertheless, enough. Within hours the video had splintered into narrative shards. Hashtags fleshed into movements. Anchors called in favor and condemnation with the equal confidence of people who had never set foot on that street. The department put out a terse, formal statement that spoke in the flat grammar of liability and procedure, but it could not wrap the moment's image in legalese. The lieutenant, now a man wearing the way of a public spectacle, watched the video on a screen that made him feel smaller, and his face folded into a map of choices. He had to decide how to protect the woman, the department, and the fragile trust between citizens and those sworn to protect them. Every choice had consequences. The woman's one call, the minute of sound that had summoned authority to her side, now summoned 1,000 voices to weigh and judge. Her name, simple and full and private, was not yet public, but she had become an emblem. People projected onto her what they were already feeling: righteous rage, tired caution, the ache of histories that would not be buried. For the officers, the video was a mirror that refused to be explained by a single story. Hargrove's face, in close-up, read like a man who had been taught to act first and think later. Carter's younger jaw quivered in the freeze frame of indecision. Online, pundits rewove the frame into parables. The woman's calm, the badge that shone like a thumbprint on sunlight. Each detail became a sentence in 1,000 different arguments. And the longer the clip circulated, the more the hour expanded outward like a bruise. Reporters gathered at the precinct, Their notebooks like talismans. Community leaders called for inquiries. An advocacy group drafted a petition. The lieutenant, who had tried to steer the narrative back toward procedure, realized that procedure could not tether a cultural moment. The footage had its own gravity. It pulled in people who had been waiting for a sign, for proof that what they felt was real. In living rooms and forums, viewers debated whether the woman's single phone call was an act of self-preservation or a weaponized badge text. For the woman herself, the subject and the actor in the suddenly public play, the clip was a theft of an intimate thing made communal, a private plea now a public demand. The world had seen only seconds. Still, those seconds would not let go. Inside the precinct, the lights hummed like a hive. Detectives and administrators convened with a measured intensity of people who understood that institutional survival often rode on the shape of a single narrative. Internal affairs opened a file, as if flipping a switch that changed the room's temperature. The lieutenant pushed for immediate transparency. Body cam footage uploaded, witness statements taken, statements to be drafted with an eye toward truth and legal safety. Hargrove and Carter were put on administrative leave pending review, their uniforms folded into plastic like artifacts. For them, the leave felt like exile, a suspended time in which their reputations were queued up for others to judge. They were human in that uneasy way, stubborn, scared, and surprised at how swiftly the world could reframe one's life. The woman was placed on administrative reassignment while the investigation unfolded. She returned to the station not as an accused criminal, but as an officer whose actions had been judged in public and who now stood under the peculiar spotlight of being both victim and internal critic. Her colleagues were a spectrum of reactions. Some offered quiet, private solidarity. Others kept their distance as if proximity could stain. As interviews were scheduled and statements taken, the slow, careful work of piecing together truth began, and with it came the modern, merciless twin, doubt. Doubt is an efficient machine. It takes pieces of truth and grinds them into question marks. People asked whether the woman had used her badge to obstruct. They asked whether the officers had misread a signal. They asked whether the crowd had framed a cruel half-truth. Each question, repeated in the press and in private, was another chisel against the skeleton of certainty. The lieutenant walked a tightrope between defending the integrity of his force and acknowledging the public's outrage. He was a man who had spent his career polishing the department's image while weathering scandals that had never left the skin of the community. He knew that the only shield against the avalanche was radical transparency. Release the footage, publish the timeline, allow an external review. But transparency is not a magic wand. It is a mirror that forces the institution to see itself with all its imperfections. The woman's single phone call had called more than an immediate chain of command. It had called into being a different system of oversight that could not be entirely controlled by the department. Meanwhile, Hargrove and Carter retreated into a world of internal legal consults, counseling sessions, and long, sleepless nights. Each replay of the viral clip felt like a verdict being passed in the court of public opinion. Hargrove, who had always believed his career a ledger of right choices, felt his ledger being rewritten. He lay awake thinking of the woman's eyes, calm, not pleading, and wondered whether a man's assumption had become a crime in itself. Carter, who had enlisted to make sense of a world he thought he could fix, felt the seams of clarity give way. The investigation was a slow, methodical machine. Statements were compared, timestamps checked, radio dispatches parsed down to stuttering syllables. The truth was not one single thing. It was a braided cord of perceptions, procedures, and histories. The neighborhood that had been the stage of the initial event found itself transformed into a symbolic battlefield. Protesters came to the block in waves, flowers, signs, chants, turning a cul-de-sac into a public sermon. A mural went up on a nearby wall, the woman's profile painted in broad strokes, her badge exaggerated to emblematic size. Community meetings convened in church basements and school auditoriums, places where people found language for grief and strategy for change. The public narrative had performed a metamorphosis. The woman was no longer just an officer who had been detained. She had become a prism through which a community viewed its own pain. Local news anchors debated statute and psyche, while residents told personal stories of encounters with law enforcement that lived like old wounds. Every testimony rang with the same tension, a demand for accountability and a fear of losing institutions that, imperfect as they were, meant protection to some. For Hargrove, the streets were a landscape of shame and bewilderment. He watched interviews where pundits spoke with a lash of certainty, and he felt as if he had been plucked from his long history and displayed like a specimen. The once familiar rhythm of life, shift, patrol, return, was disrupted by a new rhythm of calls and cameras, lawyers and lectures. His family absorbed it in private ways. The hush at the dinner table, the avoidance of relatives who had seen only the viral clip. Carter's parents sat with him in the kitchen, hands tight with worry, trying to make sense of a system that had chewed up their son's innocence and spat out complexity. The woman, meanwhile, attended the community meetings not as a figurehead but as a person, listening, speaking, holding space for pain that had nothing to do with procedures. She spoke with a voice held together by professional patience and personal grief. She told of small daily violences she had endured as a black woman in uniform. Microaggressions, assumptions, the way people's courtesy changed when they learned who she was. The crowd listened, and something shifted in the room. Behind the slogans and the flashbulbs were raw human experiences that defied tidy conclusions. The public conversation demanded outcomes. Policy changes, transparency protocols, bias training. City Hall convened hearings. The mayor called for an independent review. The lie of easy answers was exposed. The work to rebuild trust is slow, granular, human. The woman's single call had become the spark that illuminated a broader architecture of strain. People began to ask not merely who was right or wrong in that moment, but how systems had failed to accommodate nuance and humanity. The question was more painful because it required collective humility, an admission that an institution could be both necessary and flawed. When the official report landed weeks later like a dense legal document, it read as a collage of observations, facts annotated, sequences reconstructed, recommendations proposed. The External Review Board released findings that described miscommunication, an over-reliance on visual shorthand, and the need for deeper cultural work. The report concluded that the arrest should not have happened the way it did and recommended retraining, clearer identity verification protocols, and a revision of de-escalation procedures. For the public, the report felt like a resolution. For individuals, it felt like a first draft of healing. Hargrove read the pages in a kitchen lit by a single lamp. Each paragraph was a sentence in the indictment of his assumptions. He went to the mirror and watched a face he recognized and didn't recognize, someone who had been both protector and perpetrator of harm without intending either. Carter, who had listened to Lieutenant's counsel and to the quiet pleadings of his own conscience, felt an ache that lived in his ribs. He made a choice that would mark him. He requested voluntary reassignment and signed up for a department program focused on community engagement and restorative practice. The officers who had been his mentors saw it as both an admission and a courageous step, an acknowledgement that being a good cop required more than reflexes. It required listening. The woman, too, found herself in a private reckoning. The public vindication of the report did not repair the small, private wounds that lingered. The intrusive looks, the comments that carried a weight she had stoically borne for years. She went to therapy. She took time off to visit her mother. She sat with friends who held her and did not ask for explanation. Her life was suddenly both the subject of policy debates and the ordinary unfolding of human pain. There were moments of quiet grace that no tribunal could issue. A neighbor who had filmed the viral clip came to apologize in person and to hear, rather than to be heard. An older officer who had once tutored Hargrove in the ways of policing reached out across the gulf of generational habits and offered mentorship again, this time framed by humility. In private rooms, conversations happened that would not be broadcast, but that mattered. People said the things that institutions cannot. I was wrong. I didn't see you. I am sorry. These small admissions were bricks in a different kind of reconstruction, one that required vulnerability rather than the blunt instruments of policy. It was not the end. It was the beginning of what might, in time, become true repair. Months later, the street where the arrest had occurred was both familiar and haunted, like a house whose rooms hold echoes of laughter and argument. The mural remained, faded a little at the edges by sun and rain, a reminder that public memory is both fierce and fragile. The officers returned to duty in different ways, some quitting, some recommitting with new humility. Hargrove requested a leave to reflect and volunteer in a youth mentorship program. Carter continued on, carrying the weight of the lesson in the way a person carries a scar, visible sometimes, often hidden, always a reminder. The woman's career took unexpected turns. She continued to serve, but she also became a leader in a program that trained officers in cultural humility and the art of listening. She spoke at conferences with the calm force of someone translated by experience into advocacy. Her one call, the pinprick of decisive sound on that long afternoon, remained a locus in the narrative of the city, a moment that taught people the cost of assumptions and the power of accountability. Time did not make the moment disappear. It made it into an artifact that people used to measure themselves by. Families who would watch the viral clip shifted in their own private ways. Some found new trust in institutions that had at least admitted fault and tried to do better, while others found that no policy memorandum could erase the memory of a handcuffed woman in uniform. The media cycle moved on, as always, but the lives changed and carried forward the residue of the event. Friendships that had strained and mended, careers that had bent but not broken, the woman's own sense of self, reconstituted by pain and resilience. The city's leaders instituted small changes that were not grandiose but mattered. Quicker identity confirmation protocols, mandatory listening workshops, and funding for community liaisons. These were not panaceas. They were small stitches in a long healing. In a final intimate scene, months after the footage first flashed across screens, the woman stood on a small stage at a town hall, not as an icon but as a person. She spoke directly to an audience composed of colleagues, civilians, and leaders. Her voice trembled once, an honest human tremor, and then steadied. She spoke of fear and of the algebra of assumptions. She told of the single call and of how, in that compressed second, she had chosen to place a tether to accountability into the hands of someone who could act. She thanked the lieutenant who answered, the neighbor who later apologized, and the colleagues who had listened. She ended with no grand pronouncements, only a hard-earned invitation to pay attention, to ask questions, to slow down. The room was quiet in the way rooms are when they know something true has been said. Outside, the mural caught the last light and glowed like a promise that was not naive but necessary. The possibility that a single moment of courage can, if we steward it well, redirect the arc of small systems towards something better.